As you know, my name is Aaron Darty, and I want to welcome you to Faith and Politics class. This is a part of the Institute of Christian Development that I have started at Mount Carmel Baptist Church for church members, but also eventually we hope for our interns that will help them grow in their ministry skills and leadership skills as they come to us and move on, and we send them to minister wherever God has for them. I'm excited about our Institute of Christian Development. I finished up our evangelism class. As you know, it was interrupted by the coronavirus, and we had to delay the last 2 weeks. Well, actually, not delay, but I had to go virtual with it, and instead of you coming to church, we finished that up online through some YouTube videos, and that's my plan to do the same type deal with our Faith and Politics class. That was not my initial plan. My initial plan was to meet in room 101 here, next door to me, where our deacons normally meet. And that may not be the number, but you get my point of the classroom. But we were going to meet there, and due to unforeseen circumstances, and God knows what's best. We just have to trust Him. Our class will be online, so nonetheless, I had finished up all my prep work for this faith and politics class before the coronavirus struck. So it doesn't really affect anything that I'm going to teach you or was planning on teaching you. It just affects where we were going to learn. I had an ethics video that I wanted to show you as well. So if we are able to meet back, you can plan to watch those 30-minute videos with me, and then we can discuss these videos that I will be teaching you on. So this will be session one. I'm getting a lot of preliminary stuff out of the way on this lesson, this session. I want to introduce you to the authors and the books that I'm going to be using for this course. First and foremost will be a book called Politics According to the Bible by Wayne Grudem. Subtitle, A Comprehensive Resource for Understanding Modern Political Issues in Light of Scripture. Tell you a little bit about Wayne Grudem. He, just reading his bio from the back of the book, he's a research professor of theology and biblical studies at Phoenix Seminary in Phoenix, Arizona. He has a PhD from Cambridge. That's pretty good. He's an author of over 15 books, including his best-selling Systematic Theology. I just learned yesterday he's actually got a condensed version of that book. It's called Bible Doctrine. Rather than over 1,200 pages of systematic theology, he's condensed it for the average reader to take in, and he's cut out like 700 pages. So I think the guy knows what he's talking about. That's Wayne Grudem. Our next book that we'll be learning from will be called The Good and Faithful Servant by Hugh Hewitt. Subtitle, A Small Group Study on Politics and Government for Christians. And Hugh Hewitt is the host of a nationally syndicated radio show, a professor at Chapman University Law School, and the author of a dozen previous books on the subjects of politics, law, and Christianity. He is a graduate of Harvard College, so that's pretty good too. We got some well-credentialed scholars here, it looks like. And finally, we'll be using a book called Free to Believe, The Battle Over Religious Liberty in America. It was voted the 2019 Public Theology Book of the Year by the Gospel Coalition. Um, the author is Luke Goodrich. Here he is. He is a leading religious freedom attorney at the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty, um, where he has won multiple Supreme Court victories for clients, including the Little Sisters of the Poor and Hobby Lobby. He frequently discusses religious freedom on networks such as Fox News, CNN, ABC, and NPR, and in publications like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Time Magazine. So he's also a professor. All right. Here's where I'd like to begin. I'll just continue to give you some introductory material before we start to get into our topics. And I've divided our topics up into 12, 13 topics we're going to cover in the next 6 sessions. But let me just get started by reading what Wayne Grudem has to say as he introduces kind of all of these topics that we're going to get into. And one thing I want you to understand about this class, probably the most important thing, is I'm not using this as a political platform to tell you what party to vote for, or or even an individual candidate, whether they're running for president, vice president, Senate, whatever. I'm not telling you who to vote for either. This course is just meant to inform, give you more information, education about political issues in the light of our faith, which is Christianity, and then you'll be able to make a well-informed, intellectual decision about what you feel is best through prayer and seeking wisdom from God as you fill out your ballots. Now, this course is or was planned out for you to take place right before the November 2020 election. I did do that on purpose. Would like to finish this course a couple weeks before the election, so we've covered all the material, and you'll be able to make a well-informed decision as you go to the polls. Okay, so when I introduce to you these topics, I'm going to introduce you by saying the author says, so you understand that the information is not coming from me. I may say some things, I may read some things that I don't agree with. Nonetheless, I want you to understand that this is simply what the author of the books I just introduced to you, this is simply what they believe and what they are saying, okay? So no one is holding a gun to your head, saying vote for, such and such. That's the beautiful thing about America, right? We live in the land of the free, home of the brave. We have free choice, and we want to keep it that way as long as we can, and that's why voting is important. Okay, let's get started. Wayne Grudem says this: the Democratic and Republican parties have come to represent very different basic positions today. Now, understand that Grudem wrote this book in 2010 while President Obama was in office. And it's very relevant for today and the times that we live in, even though we're 10 years after the time that Grudem wrote this. Grudem continues, and the elected officials of those parties support those positions both by their individual votes, usually along party lines, and by the votes they bring to electing the leaders in the House and the Senate. Leaders who determine the course of all legislation. In the current situation in the United States, early 2010, the policies favored by the Democratic and Republican parties have moved far apart on dozens of very important issues. The Republican Party has been dominated by people favoring smaller government, lower taxes, strong defense, traditional moral standards regarding abortion and marriage. the promotion of democracy, and the promotion of free market economies. These stances seem to me to be consistent with biblical teachings on government and a biblical worldview, as I explained in chapters 3 and 4. And you might want to get the book for yourself. By contrast, the Democratic Party has come to be dominated by people favoring larger government, higher taxes, more reliance on negotiations rather than superior military force in dealing with enemies, opposition to biblical moral standards on abortion and homosexual marriage, and promotion of a more socialist leaning economy that is highly controlled by government. These policies seem to me to be at odds with a biblical worldview and with biblical teachings regarding government. See chapters 3 and 4. In this chapter, I summarize the earlier discussions in the book and compare my policy conclusions with the policies favored by the majority of Republicans and the majority of Democrats, or by those who have determined the policy decisions in their respective parties. So there you go. There's Grudem's take on Republicans and Democrats, and where Grudem is going to move to next is the subject of the courts and ultimate power in a nation. And so regarding that, Grudem says, in chapter 5, we considered the question of the courts and the ultimate power in a nation. The American system of government as forged by the Founding Fathers gave the ultimate power in the nation, not to any person or groups of persons, but to a document, the United States Constitution, which could be changed by the people of the nation, but only with great difficulty. Subject to that Constitution, power was divided among the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government, and was also divided among national, state, and local governments. In this way, no one was given excessive power. The laws were to be made by the legislative branch and interpreted and applied by the judicial branch, or the courts. But the system no longer functions in the way it was set up to function, because judges, especially the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court, have increasingly begun to base their decisions not on the actual wording of the Constitution or the original meaning of the words when they were written, but on the justices' own ideas of what should be done in a society. In this way, they have begun to make laws, rather than just interpret and evaluate laws that have been made by the Congress. By this process, the Supreme Court has become the most powerful group in the nation, usurping to itself powers that the Constitution never intended to have. The result is that the Supreme Court has imposed on the nation a whole series of left-leaning or liberal-leaning policies that have not been approved by a majority of the people themselves. Policies that give legal protection to abortions, exclude religion from much of public life, take away private property and give it to other private parties, restrict the use of the death penalty, and in many other ways override the right of the people to decide their own laws through democratically elected representatives. Chapter 5 concluded that the excessive power of the Supreme Court is the most serious problem facing the United States of America today. The American system of government is broken, no longer functioning as the Constitution directed that it should function. Democrats favor appointing Supreme Court justices who will continue in this direction of making laws and policies rather than just interpreting and applying them. By contrast, Republicans have almost uniformly favored appointing state judges, federal judges, and Supreme Court justices who will judge according to the original intent of the laws and the federal and state constitutions to which they are subject. I argued that the only way to change the situation in the U.S. would be the consistent election of Republican candidates for state and national offices, so that the entire judicial system will increasingly be staffed by judges who will judge according to the original intent of the law and the Constitution. You've probably heard that, the originalist, right, when it comes to interpreting the Constitution. You know, we used to be called a land, of the people, by the people, for the people. But one thing I've heard recently is, we've become a land, you know, of the courts, by the judges, for the minority. It's kind of got twisted. And Grudem is exactly right when he talks about what has happened in our land related to the Supreme Court really having ultimate authority, even more power than the president himself when it comes to making laws. Well, I want to stay on this same course and introduce to you what Hugh Hewitt has to say. And Hugh will pose a lot of questions to you. And these questions are just meant to simply make you think about the subject, and how you might go about wading in these waters. Hugh says, is there a Christian attitude toward judges? Republicans generally, in their highest profile nominees, almost always support an approach to judging known as originalism, and are thus committed to a very narrow approach to judging. Almost all originalist judges think a Roe versus Wade was wrongly decided and would uphold restrictions on abortion passed by state legislators and the Congress, and many would reverse Roe entirely. Democrats, by contrast, support activist judges who believe their job should involve pushing forward rules that equalize conditions in America and reverse the effects of past failings, such as racial discrimination and discrimination against women. They are less concerned with the rights of private property owners, less worried about the rights of gun owners, and dedicated to the easy availability of abortion. Given this very clear distinction between the parties, should a Christian be predisposed toward a Republican or Democratic candidate for the presidency of the U.S. Senate on the basis of their likely approach to judicial nominees and confirmations? If we are called to be serious opponents of abortion or pornography, aren't Christians obliged to take these differences between the parties seriously when voting? Or does an activist judge's solicitude for the rights of the long oppressed oblige us to set aside their activism in other areas that can be influenced through other means and hope for their appointment and domination of the bench? Again, I'm not going to tell you what to think. That's between you and the Lord. But I do love how Hugh brings some very good questions to the table, and these are questions that we can discuss, and you can jot down answers to, whether we have an online format or whether we're able to meet again and discuss these issues in person. Well, Luke Goodrich in Free to Believe, he says this, and we're getting close to concluding session 1. Goodrich says, abortion rights activists aren't content with abortion being legal. They want it to be socially and morally accepted. The greatest impediment to that goal is the existence of conscientious objectors, so those people must be repressed. Nor is this a secret. A leading ACLU attorney has acknowledged that her goal is to establish a norm that declining to perform an abortion is an illegal act of sex discrimination. And we're going to get into a lot of the terms that refer to discrimination. And trust me, there's it seems like almost anything can be discriminated against. Perhaps you haven't heard that term, sex discrimination. But we're going to get into a lot of other types of discrimination. So that's going to conclude our session one. And actually, no. Actually, we're going to continue. We're just scratching the surface. Wow. Hey, this is what happens in a session one. Okay, so we need to move forward and talk about the protection of life. Got things a little backwards there because I just got into it with what Goodrich had to say. So that's actually a good segue into abortion rights and stuff. And Wayne Grudem has this to say. He says, in Chapter 6, I argued that abortion is the intentional taking of an innocent human life, and that this should be prohibited by laws in all cases except to save the life of the mother. On this question, Democrats in general, not every single Democrat, but uniformly in the national leadership positions, favor a woman's right to choose, which means they do not favor any enactment of laws that would restrict a woman's right to take the life of her own preborn child. By contrast, Republicans in general, not every single Republican, but uniformly in their top national leadership, have favored laws that protect the life of preborn children. I also argued, however, that no significant change to laws regarding abortions can ever happen in the United States until the Supreme Court overrules its 1973 decision Roe v. Wade. This will only happen when there is a sufficient number of original intent justices to overturn that decision, and they will only be appointed by Republican presidents and confirmed by a sufficient number of Republican senators in the U.S. Senate. Chapter 6 also concluded that euthanasia, in the sense of actively taking steps to put an old or very ill patient to death, is prohibited by the biblical commands against murder. More liberal Democrats have tended to favor the liberalization of laws regarding euthanasia, but some Democrats have opposed this. Nearly all Republicans, at least on the level of national leadership, have opposed giving people the legal right to take the life of a terminally ill or very old patient. Regarding capital punishment, I argued that the Bible supports the government's right to carry out capital punishment, at least in the case of premeditated murder. The viewpoints of Democrats and Republicans are not entirely predictable on this question, but a significantly larger number of Republicans would favor the use of capital punishment, at least for premeditated murder, and a significant proportion of Democrats would oppose the use of capital punishment in all cases. In 2008, the Gallup poll found that only 52% of Democrats support the use of capital punishment, compared with 78% of Republicans and 66% of independents. Finally, I argued in Chapter 6 that government should allow people to have some effective means of self-defense. And in nations where there are already many gun owners, this would mean permitting private citizens to own guns for the purpose of self-defense, with reasonable restrictions preventing convicted felons and mentally ill people, for example, from owning guns. Republicans candidates in general, by a large proportion, have favored the rights of citizens to own guns. On the other hand, as of 2009, 60% of Democrats would support a stricter gun control law, compared with 13% of Republicans and 17% of independents. Opposition to all gun ownership has been a consistent pattern of more liberal political groups and other nations as well. And boy, a lot has happened since 2010, hasn't it, when it relates to gun crime in America. You think of the clubs and the bars, shootings, and just so many public venues now. Well, as we move forward, Hugh Hewitt has some more great questions for us to consider as it relates to this topic. He says, what does God say about unborn children? Does God approve of abortion? Is he neutral about the practice? Does abortion equal sin, and if so, what sort? Does complacency about abortion also equal sin? Can a Christian in good conscience choose to avoid the issue because of its many sensitivities? Can a Christian vote for a pro abortion rights politician on the grounds that other issues trump this one? He continues, when you stand before God and Christ for your final judgment, do you imagine part of that judgment will be your action or inaction with regard to abortion? Are you relying on the atoning mission of Christ to cover your record on this issue? Or does it not even enter in your consideration of your own sinfulness? And if God is indeed outraged by the loss of millions and millions of lives, cut short of their full flower, ought you to be outraged as well? And should you be active somehow in ending the practice? On a very personal level, should you at least support the efforts of a crisis pregnancy center to provide alternatives to abortion? Should you, on a personal level, at least be trying to save one life or more through an investment of time or money? And should your voting reflect your thoughtful consideration of these questions? Okay, now we are getting closer to finishing session one. And, we got into the topic of euthanasia a little as well, didn't we? Hugh says, this is an unpleasant subject, and the prospect of our own deaths or the deaths of those we love often lead us to turn away from the conversation about how best to deal with end-of-life issues. But as the number of elderly grow and the cost of their care skyrocket, the pressure to increase the availability of legal life-ending options will increase. Already, the California Democratic Party called for physician-assisted suicide to be part of their state platform. The National Democratic Party's platform is silent on the subject. The entire ideology of the left, however, moves toward the idea that human life can be ended when its quality is compromised. A necessary and logical extension of late-term abortion theory, even as it is of stem cell research on human embryos. Once any human life becomes less than sacred, the utility of all human life becomes a matter for debate and majoritarian conclusions. The question for this week is whether you agree with that last paragraph. Is the Democratic Party on a path that will inevitably oblige it to embrace assisted suicide as an option that should be available to all Americans? The Washington and Oregon laws were enacted via direct initiative. Who do you think voted for them? People of faith or secularists? Liberals or conservatives? And does the issue really matter? Well, that's going to end our session today. And I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you back for session 2.